The boardroom went dead silent. Caleb's attorney slid the documents across the glass table, and Simone didn't even flinch. She just smiled. Slow. Quiet. The kind of smile that had been waiting 4 years to finally arrive. "You can't do this," Caleb said, his voice cracking at the edges. "This is my company." Simone finally looked up. Her eyes, dark, steady, unflinching, met his across the table like she was seeing him clearly for the very first time. She said softly. "It was your company, Caleb." She slid the documents back toward him. Her name was on every page. Every subsidiary. Every account. Every brick of the Atlanta empire he thought he'd built alone. "I've been the controlling shareholder since the beginning." She stood slowly, buttoning her blazer with a kind of calm that only comes from a woman who planned this from the very day her heart broke. "You just never thought to check." The room held its breath. Caleb stared at the woman he'd married, the woman he dismissed, underestimated, and betrayed, and for the first time in their entire relationship, he had absolutely nothing to say. Before we go into this story, hit the subscribe now, like and comment where you are watching from. Atlanta never slept, and neither did Simone Caldwell Price. By 5:47 a.m., she was already at the kitchen island of their Buckhead home, laptop open, glasses on, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped waiting for anyone to notice how hard she worked. The coffee she'd made for two sat on the counter. Caleb's cup, untouched. Cold. He hadn't come home last night. She knew. She always knew. Simone closed the tab she'd been working in, a private equity report she wasn't supposed to have access to, though access had always been a complicated word in her world, and opened her calendar instead. Board meeting at 9. Site walkthrough at noon. A call with her attorney at 3 that Caleb didn't know about. She removed her glasses and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. 4 years. 4 years of this marriage, and she still sometimes sat in the quiet of this enormous kitchen. Marble countertops, custom cabinets, a view of Atlanta's skyline just beginning to blush gold, and asked herself the same question she never answered out loud. "How long are you going to let this go on, Simone?" She heard the door. Caleb came in the way men do when they think their silence is an explanation. Keys dropped too casually on the entryway table, jacket draped over the chair rather than hung up, footsteps light like he could walk back into this house and undo the night just by not mentioning it. He was still handsome. That had never been the problem. Caleb Price, blue eyes, sharp jaw, the particular kind of white boy confidence that came from never once being told no by the world, walked into the kitchen and went straight for the coffee like nothing in the universe was wrong. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," Simone replied without looking at him. He poured his coffee, took a sip, leaned against the counter across from her. "Big day?" he asked. "Every day is a big day, Caleb." A pause settled between them, thick and practiced, the kind that long marriages build like scar tissue. Caleb set his mug down and looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize, the one that said, "I know you know, and I'm going to pretend you don't." "I stayed at the office," he said. "The Henderson deal is closing and—" "I know." 2 words. No anger. No tears. Just the flat, clear surface of a woman who had long ago moved her pain somewhere he couldn't reach it. Caleb blinked. "You know about the Henderson deal?" She finally looked up at him. "Closing Friday. You need the Meridian contracts reviewed before then. I had my assistant pull the files last week." He stared at her. That was the thing about Caleb, he always forgot. He forgot that the woman he came home to, the woman he dismissed at dinner parties with a hand on her back and a "Simone handles the home stuff," was the same woman who had quietly, methodically, patiently built something he didn't fully understand yet. He thought she handled the home stuff. He had no idea what she actually handled. Simone Caldwell had grown up in Southwest Atlanta, not the Atlanta of rooftop bars and Porsche SUVs, but the Atlanta of church potlucks and second jobs and mothers who ironed their work uniforms the night before so they'd be ready. Her mother, Gloria, had worked 31 years as an administrative assistant for a commercial real estate firm downtown. Smart woman. Brilliant, even. The kind of woman who knew every deal in that office before the partners did, and got credit for none of it. Simone had watched that her entire life. She'd gone to Spelman on a full academic scholarship. Then Wharton for her MBA, where she'd been one of 6 black women in her cohort and had learned early that the smartest person in the room was rarely the loudest one. She'd come back to Atlanta with a quiet fire and a 5-year plan that had nothing to do with being anyone's wife. She'd met Caleb at a real estate investors conference. He'd been charming, God, he'd been charming, and ambitious, and he'd looked at her like she was extraordinary. Like he saw her. She'd been 31, and she'd been tired of being lonely, and she'd let herself believe that a man looking at you that way meant something permanent. She'd been wrong. But she hadn't been careless. Even on the day she married him, Simone had been careful. Methodical. She'd restructure her holdings 3 months before the wedding, quietly, through a series of holding companies that her personal attorney managed, so that what appeared on their joint financial disclosures was only what she chose to show. She wasn't hiding anything. She was simply protecting what she'd built before he arrived. The irony, the thing that would hit Caleb like a train one day soon, was that without Simone's quiet, invisible financial architecture underneath his company, Price Property Group would have collapsed 18 months ago. She had moved money, restructured debt, brought in investors through back channels who thought they were dealing with a faceless holding company called Caldwell Meridian Group. They were. They just didn't know Caldwell Meridian was Simone. Across town, in a glass-walled office on the 34th floor of a midtown high-rise, Caleb Price sat behind a desk that felt like a throne and acted accordingly. His assistant brought his second coffee. His VP of acquisitions laughed at his jokes. His name was on the building's directory in gold letters 2 inches tall. He called a woman named Brianna from his private cell at 11:04 a.m., a call that lasted 9 minutes and involved the kind of soft laughter and lowered voice that meant nothing good. He hung up and spun his chair to face the Atlanta skyline. He felt, as he often did, completely in control. That evening, Simone sat across from her best friend Kezia at a quiet restaurant in Inman Park, candlelit, intimate, the kind of place where the food was secondary to the conversation. "How long?" Kezia asked quietly. She already knew about Brianna. Simone had known for 3 months. Simone swirled her glass of red wine slowly. "Long enough." "And the plan?" Simone set the glass down. Outside, Atlanta's Friday night hummed and glittered. Inside, her eyes were the calmest thing in the room. "It's already in motion," she said simply. Kezia studied her friend, this woman who had survived being overlooked her entire life, who had learned to move in silence, who had built an empire in the margins while everyone looked the other way, and felt something close to awe. "He has no idea, does he?" Kezia whispered. Simone picked up her glass again. "Not yet," she said. And somewhere across the city, Caleb Price ordered a bottle of champagne for a woman who wasn't his wife, and toasted to a future he didn't know he'd already lost. If Simone just gave you chills, you already know this story is different. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment she takes everything back. And drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were capable of? The call came on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday. Not a stormy, cinematic, something is wrong Tuesday. Just an ordinary Atlanta Tuesday, humid and bright, the kind of afternoon where the city smelled like cut grass and car exhaust and someone's jerk chicken from a food truck 2 blocks over. Simone was in a conference room on the 28th floor of her attorney's building when her phone lit up with a name she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. She excused herself from the table. 3 attorneys, 2 financial advisors, and a document that would change everything all looked up briefly then looked back down, and stepped into the hallway. "Hello. Is this Simone Price?" A woman's voice. Young. Uncertain. Like she'd rehearsed this call 6 times and still wasn't ready. "It is." A long pause. "My name is Brianna. Brianna Holloway." Another pause. "I think I know, your husband has been lying to both of us." Simone stood very still in that hallway. The air conditioning hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a printer whirred. The city glittered 30 floors below through floor-to-ceiling windows, and Simone looked at none of it. She had known about Brianna for 3 months. She had a name, a face from an Instagram profile that wasn't fully private, a rough timeline pieced together from calendar gaps and credit card statements, and the particular way Caleb's phone screen had started facing down at dinner. But knowing and hearing, those were 2 entirely different wounds. "How did you get this number?" Simone asked. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steadiness her entire life. "He left his iPad at my apartment." Brianna's voice cracked slightly. "I wasn't snooping, I saw your contact and I thought you deserved to know." I didn't know he was married. Not at first. And then when I found out, I tried to end it, and he told me." She stopped. Took a breath. "He told me you two were separated. That you were basically roommates. That the marriage was over in every way that mattered." Roommates. Simone closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. She thought about last Thursday morning, Caleb's hand on the small of her back as they stood together at their neighbor's birthday brunch. The way he'd leaned in and said, "You look beautiful today," with a smile so easy, so practiced, that she'd almost, for just one fractured second, let herself believe he meant it. Roommates. "Are you still there?" Brianna asked quietly. "I'm here," Simone said. "I'm sorry," the young woman whispered. "I know this doesn't fix anything. I couldn't keep being part of something I didn't fully understand. And I thought you should hear it from a person instead of just finding out some other way." There was something genuine in her voice. Something that in another life, another circumstance, Simone might have recognized as integrity. "Thank you for calling," Simone said carefully. "Brianna, how long?" A pause. 14 months. The hallway held absolutely still. 14 months. Simone and Caleb had celebrated their 3rd anniversary 11 months ago. He had booked a suite at the St. Regis. He had ordered champagne. He had looked across the dinner table at her with those blue eyes and said, "I'd choose you every time, Simone," and she had believed him. She had sat there in a red dress she'd bought specifically for that night, and she had believed him. She ended the call quietly. No dramatics. No shaking hands. She stood in the hallway for 43 seconds, she counted, and then she straightened her blazer, walked back into the conference room, and sat down. "Sorry," she said calmly. "Where were we?" Her lead attorney, a sharp woman named Diane who had known Simone for 9 years, looked at her carefully. Simone gave the smallest nod. Diane looked back at her documents. "We were discussing the shareholder transfer," Diane said. "The final signatures." "Right." Simone picked up her pen. "Let's finish." She didn't cry until she was in her car. And even then, even in the private dark of her parking garage, engine off, city muffled around her, it wasn't the heaving, broken kind of crying that people imagine when a marriage fractures. It was quieter than that. The kind of crying that happens when you've already grieved something slowly for so long that the confirmation almost feels like a mercy. She sat there for 11 minutes. She thought about her mother, Gloria, ironing her uniform at midnight. She thought about Spellman and Wharton and every room she'd ever walked into where someone had looked past her before she'd said a single word. She thought about being 23 and being told she was impressive for someone like her. She thought about building and building and building in silence while the world handed men like Caleb a throne just for showing up. And she thought about love, real love, the kind she'd actually wanted, and how she'd made the mistake of believing she'd found it. She wiped her face. Started the car. And when she pulled out of that parking garage and onto the bright Atlanta street, something had shifted behind her eyes. Something that had been patient and careful and quietly waiting had finally, fully arrived. She wasn't angry. Anger was too simple for what Simone Caldwell Price was feeling. She was done. That evening, Caleb came home to a candlelit dinner. Simone had cooked, really cooked, the way she hadn't in months. The table was set. Music played low in the background. She was in the kitchen in a simple black dress, her locks pinned up, a glass of red wine already poured for each of them. Caleb stopped in the doorway. "What's all this?" he asked, surprised and slightly cautious in the way guilty people get when kindness arrives unexpectedly. Simone turned from the stove and smiled at him. It was the same smile from the boardroom, the one that had been waiting 4 years to arrive. He didn't recognize it yet. "Sit down, Caleb," she said warmly. "I made your favorite." He sat. She served. They talked about small things, his day, traffic on 285, a restaurant they'd been meaning to try. He relaxed. He laughed twice. He refilled her wine glass without being asked, and for a moment looked almost like the man she thought she'd married. Simone watched him across the candlelight, and thought about the documents she'd signed that afternoon. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly, as he reached for his fork. "Anything," he said easily. "Are you happy, Caleb? In this marriage? Genuinely, are you happy?" He looked up. Something flickered across his face. Guilt, calculation, the practiced warmth of a man deciding in real time which version of himself to offer. "Of course I am," he said. "You're my wife." Simone nodded slowly. "Good," she said quietly. And she smiled again and let him have the rest of his dinner in peace. Because in 4 days, everything he thought he owned would have her name on it. And the least she could do was let him enjoy his last comfortable meal. The first sign came on a Wednesday. Caleb was in the middle of a call with his VP of acquisitions, feet up on his desk, jacket off, the particular looseness of a man who believed his world was exactly where he'd left it, when his CFO knocked and entered without waiting. That alone was unusual. Derek Moss had worked for Price Property Group for 6 years. He was methodical, unreadable, the kind of financial mind that expressed alarm through slight changes in posture rather than tone. He was standing slightly too straight. Caleb lowered his feet from the desk. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone. Derek closed the door behind him and placed a single sheet of paper on the desk, a preliminary audit flag from their primary lending bank. 3 accounts had been quietly restructured over the past 18 months. The restructuring was legal, clean, expertly done. But the ownership trail on 2 subsidiary companies that Caleb had always assumed were his, fully, completely his, led somewhere unexpected. A holding company called Caldwell Meridian Group. Caleb stared at the paper. "What is this?" he asked. "We don't fully know yet," Derek said carefully. "But whoever Caldwell Meridian is, they have a significant position in this company. Significant enough that any major acquisition decision technically requires their approval." Caleb read the paper again. Caldwell. He looked up slowly. "Get me Diane Foster's office," he said. Diane was his personal attorney. Had been for years. Derek nodded and left. Caleb sat alone in his glass-walled office. Atlanta spread out below him, gold and enormous and indifferent, and for the first time in a very long time, felt a cold draft move through the room. He didn't mention it to Simone that night. He watched her instead, the way you watch something when you've suddenly realized you may never have actually seen it clearly. She moved through their evening the way she always did, unhurried, self-contained, present in that particular Simone way that had once felt like peace to him and now felt like something he couldn't name. She was reading on the sofa when he came downstairs after his shower. Locks down, glasses on, legs folded underneath her. A novel. Something by a black woman author whose name he'd never bothered to learn. "Long day?" she asked without looking up. "The Henderson deal is getting complicated," he said, which was true and also not remotely what was complicated. She turned a page. "You'll figure it out." He sat across from her. "Simone." She looked up. "Caldwell Meridian Group," he said carefully, watching her face. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Not a flicker. Not a breath caught. Not a single micro-expression that a guilty person couldn't have controlled with enough preparation. She tilted her head slightly. "Should it?" she asked. Caleb held her gaze for a long moment. Simone held it back, steady, open, patient, the way she'd held every gaze in every room where someone had tried to read her and found only what she wanted them to find. "Just something that came up in a meeting," he said finally. "Okay." She went back to her book. He watched her for another moment. Then he got up and went to the kitchen for water he didn't need, and stood at the counter in the dark staring at the Atlanta skyline, that same skyline that had always looked like his, and felt the cold draft again. Stronger this time. He called Brianna the next morning from his car. She didn't answer. He called again. Voicemail. He sent a text, "Hey, been thinking about you," the kind of text that only reads as casual if you don't know what it's actually asking, which was, "Are you still mine? Is this still mine? Is anything still mine?" She didn't reply. By noon, he'd driven past her apartment building on the west side, just drove past, he told himself, just in the neighborhood, and noticed her car wasn't there. Hadn't been moved in days, judging by the thin layer of pollen sitting undisturbed on the hood. Something had shifted. He just didn't know yet how many things. Simone had lunch with Kezia on Thursday, same quiet Inman Park restaurant, same corner table, same candlelight that made everything feel like a confession. He asked about Caldwell Meridian, Simone said. Kezia set down her fork. "And I looked at him like he'd said a word in a language I didn't speak." She picked up her wine. He backed down in about 40 seconds. Kezia exhaled. "Simone, when does this actually happen?" "Monday." She said it the way you say sunrise, like it's simply a fact of nature. Inevitable. Already written. The board meeting is Monday. Diane files the formal disclosure Friday afternoon, after markets close. And he won't know until he walks into that boardroom and I'm already sitting at the head of the table. She paused. Where I've always belonged. Kezia was quiet for a moment. How are you really doing? She asked softly. Because Kezia had known Simone since Spellman and knew that the calmer Simone appeared, the more carefully you needed to ask. Simone was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Atlanta moved in its Friday afternoon rhythm. People rushing, laughing, living their uncomplicated lives in the sunshine. I keep thinking about the St. Regis, she said finally. Quietly. Our anniversary. The red dress. She turned her wine glass slowly. Not because I miss him. I stopped missing him a long time ago. She looked up. I miss who I thought he was. I miss believing that was real. Kezia reached across the table and covered her hand. It's okay to grieve that, Kezia said softly. Even while you're burning it down. Simone looked at her best friend, this woman who had shown up for her since they were 19 and broke and brilliant and had no idea yet what they were going to become, and felt the first genuine warmth she'd felt in weeks. I know, Simone said quietly. She squeezed Kezia's hand. Then she let go. But the grieving is done, she said simply. Monday is just the closing chapter. That Sunday night, Caleb came home and found Simone already in bed, asleep, or appearing to be. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of her breathing in the darkness. He'd spent the weekend unable to reach Brianna. Unable to get a straight answer from Derek about the Caldwell Meridian audit. Unable to shake the feeling that the ground beneath his feet, that solid marble Atlanta skyline ground he'd stood on so confidently for so long, had developed a crack he couldn't locate. He looked at his wife sleeping. You're my wife, he'd said 4 days ago across the candlelight. He slid into bed quietly, lay in the dark, stared at the ceiling, and for the very first time in 4 years of marriage to Simone Caldwell Price, Caleb Price felt something he had absolutely no framework for feeling about this woman. Fear. Sunday nights in the Caldwell house, her mother's house, the one Simone had bought for Gloria 3 years ago in a quiet College Park neighborhood with a porch and a magnolia tree in the front yard, always smelled like cornbread and hair grease and the particular warmth of a woman who had loved her children loudly in a world that had been quiet about loving her back. Simone came every Sunday. Even now. Especially now. She sat at her mother's kitchen table the way she'd sat there since she was 7 years old, shoes off, feet tucked under her, the city's noise completely gone, while Gloria moved around the kitchen with the unhurried authority of a woman entirely at home in her own space. You're not eating, Gloria said without turning around. I'm eating. You're moving food around the plate, baby. That's not the same thing. Simone put a forkful in her mouth obediently. Gloria turned from the stove and looked at her daughter, really looked, the way mothers do when they've spent 36 years learning every version of your face, and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Tell me, she said simply. Simone looked at her mother. At the hands that had ironed uniforms at midnight. At the face that had never once in 36 years let Simone see her break. Not when Simone's father left. Not when the real estate firm passed Gloria over for a promotion she'd earned 4 times. Not when the world kept handing grace to everyone in the room except her. Monday is the board meeting, Simone said. Gloria nodded slowly. She knew about Caldwell Meridian. She was one of 3 people in the world who did. And Caleb has no idea. Gloria was quiet for a moment. Outside, the magnolia tree moved slightly in the evening wind. The kitchen clock ticked. And your heart? Gloria asked softly. Simone looked down at her plate. That was the question, wasn't it? The one she'd been navigating around for weeks, months, the one she answered differently depending on what time of day it was and whether the city was loud or quiet and whether she'd slept. I loved him, she said finally. Quietly. Like a confession she'd been holding in her chest for a long time. I know people are going to hear this story and think I was always 3 steps ahead. That I was always cold. Always calculated. She shook her head. I wasn't. When I married him I was just a woman who wanted someone to come home to. Gloria reached across the table. I know, baby. I built the protection because I'm my mother's daughter. Simone's voice was steady, but her eyes had gone soft and bright. "Because I watched you give 31 years to people who never once put your name on anything. And I swore when I was 19 years old sitting in this kitchen, that no one would ever be able to take what I built. Not a company. Not a man. Not anyone." Gloria's hand tightened over hers. "You protected yourself," Gloria said softly. "That's not cold. That's survival." "Then why does it feel like grief?" Simone whispered. The kitchen was very quiet. Gloria stood slowly and came around the table and put her arms around her daughter from behind, the way she'd done when Simone was 7 and skinned her knee, when she was 17 and didn't get the scholarship she wanted, when she was 23 and called from Wharton crying because the loneliness of being the only one in the room was heavier than she'd expected. Simone closed her eyes. Let herself be held. Just for a moment. Just in this kitchen. Just here where she didn't have to be Caldwell Meridian, or the controlling shareholder, or the woman with the plan. Just here where she could be Gloria's daughter and feel the full weight of everything she'd carried quietly for so long. "It feels like grief," Gloria said softly into her hair, "because you're human, Simone. And you loved someone who didn't love you right. That's allowed to hurt." She pulled back and looked at her daughter's face. "And Monday is not revenge. Don't you let it feel like revenge." Simone looked at her. "Then what is it?" she asked. Gloria smoothed her daughter's hair back from her face, gentle, deliberate, the way she'd done 10,000 times. "It's reclamation," she said firmly. "You're taking back what was already yours." Simone drove home through Atlanta at 9 p.m., the city lit and breathing around her, gospel still faint in her ears from her mother's kitchen radio, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Clarity. Not the cold, strategic clarity of boardrooms and legal documents. Something warmer than that. Something that felt like the morning after a long rain when the air is clean and the city looks newly made and you remember, viscerally, that you were built for exactly this. She parked in the Buckhead driveway. Sat for a moment. Looked up at the house, enormous, beautiful, every surface chosen by her, every renovation managed by her, the garden designed by her hands on a Sunday afternoon 3 years ago when she'd still been trying to make this feel like a home instead of a performance. It had always been hers. Tomorrow it would simply be official. Inside, Caleb was on the phone in his study, voice low, urgent, the particular hushed tone of a man running out of ground to stand on. She caught fragments as she passed the closed door. "The audit flags aren't going away. I need to know who Caldwell Meridian." She didn't slow down. She walked upstairs, washed her face, moisturized her skin with the shea butter cream her mother had been buying her since college, and climbed into bed with a novel she'd been reading all week. She read 4 pages and fell into the best sleep she'd had in months. In his study below, Caleb sat in the dark long after the call ended. He'd hired a private investigator that afternoon, a quiet, efficient man named Roland who'd done work for him twice before. He'd given Roland one name. Caldwell Meridian Group. Roland had called back in 3 hours. The silence after that call had lasted 40 minutes. Because what Roland found, what the trail of holding companies and shell structures and legal documents eventually, undeniably, led back to, was a name Caleb knew. Had slept next to for 4 years. Had underestimated for 4 years. He sat in the dark of his study in the house that had her name on the deed. Had always had her name on the deed, he realized now, every document he'd signed without reading carefully, every closing where he trusted her to handle the paperwork, every moment he'd waved his hand and said Simone handles that stuff, and felt the full, crashing weight of what he had not seen. She hadn't trapped him. She hadn't schemed against him. She had simply, quietly, methodically, with the patience of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life, built something extraordinary. And he had been so busy performing power that he'd never once looked at the woman sitting across the breakfast table and understood what she actually was. He pressed his hands flat on the desk. Stared at nothing. How long? He thought. How long has she known that I? He couldn't finish the thought. Because the answer to that question, he was beginning to understand, said far less about Simone than it did about him. At 11:47 p.m., his phone lit up. A calendar invitation. Price Property Group, Emergency Board Meeting. Monday 9 a.m. Mandatory attendance. Sent from an account he didn't recognize. Sent from Caldwell Meridian Group. He stared at the notification for a long time. Then he looked up at the ceiling, at the house above him, at the woman sleeping in the bed above him, at the life he'd constructed on a foundation he'd never thought to examine, and understood with the slow and total clarity of a man who had run out of ways to avoid the truth, that Monday was not going to be a meeting. Monday was going to be a reckoning. Monday morning arrived the way reckonings always do. Quietly. Ordinarily. Like any other day. The Atlanta sky was pale gold at 6 a.m., that particular early morning light that makes the city look freshly made, unhurried, full of possibility. Birds in the magnolia trees. Coffee brewing. The distant rhythm of the interstate already beginning its morning pulse. Simone was up at 5. She stood in her walk-in closet for a long time, longer than necessary, moving through the deliberate ritual of a woman who understood that how you arrive matters. She chose a deep burgundy suit. Structured. Sharp. The kind of suit that doesn't ask for the room's attention, it simply takes it. Her locks pinned up, a single gold necklace that had been her grandmother's, heels that added 2 inches she didn't need. She looked at herself in the mirror. For a long, quiet moment she just looked. Not checking. Not adjusting. Just seeing herself. Fully. The girl from Southwest Atlanta who had sat in her mother's kitchen and made a promise. The woman who had walked into Wharton and Spelman and every boardroom and conference room and investor meeting and refused to shrink. The wife who had loved genuinely and been betrayed quietly and grieved privately and rebuilt completely. She looked at herself and felt, rising through her chest like a slow exhale. Ready. Caleb was in the kitchen when she came downstairs. He was already in his suit, gray expensive, the one he wore when he wanted to project authority. He was standing at the counter with his coffee, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept and was working very hard not to show it. He looked up when she walked in. And something moved across his face, something complicated and raw that she hadn't seen there in a long time. Not guilt exactly. Not anger. Something closer to the expression of a man seeing a painting he'd walked past every day and realizing for the first time what it actually was. He opened his mouth. Simone. Don't, she said quietly. Not harshly. Not with anger. Just, don't. The single word of a woman who had already had every version of this conversation inside herself and needed none of them out loud. She poured her coffee. Added her cream. Picked up her bag from the entryway. I'll see you at the meeting, Caleb, she said simply. And she walked out the front door into the gold Atlanta morning and didn't look back. The boardroom was on the 34th floor. Simone arrived at 8:40 a.m., 20 minutes early, and when the elevator doors opened she walked down the corridor with the particular unhurried certainty of a woman who had been the most prepared person in every room she'd ever entered and was simply continuing a lifelong habit. Diane was already there. 3 members of the board, older men, 2 white, 1 black, all of whom had spent 4 years looking through Simone at board dinners, were already seated. They looked up when she entered. Then they looked again. Because there was something different about her this morning that had nothing to do with the burgundy suit or the gold necklace or the 2 added inches. Something behind her eyes that rearranged the entire geometry of the room. She sat at the head of the table. Nobody said anything. Caleb arrived at 8:58. He walked through the boardroom door mid-sentence, already talking to his VP of acquisitions, already performing the comfortable authority of a man entering his own space, and stopped. He saw the room. He saw the board members already seated. He saw Diane Foster, his attorney, sitting along the wall with a careful neutral expression of a woman who had changed sides months ago. And he saw Simone. At the head of his table. In his boardroom. In his building. The conversation died in his throat. The room was completely silent. Simone looked at him across the length of the table, steady, unhurried, the full force of everything she was finally visible and no longer contained, and said nothing. She didn't need to. The documents in front of every board member said everything. Caleb walked slowly to his usual chair. Sat down. He looked at the documents. His name appeared exactly once, as a minority shareholder, 22%. Below the signature line of the controlling interest, which read, in clean black type, Caldwell Meridian Group, Simone A. Caldwell Price, controlling shareholder, 51%. He looked up at her. How long? He asked quietly. His voice was different, stripped of its performance, nothing left but the raw question of a man holding the pieces of something he'd broken without knowing it was breakable. Since before we married, Simone said simply. I restructured before the wedding. Protected what I'd built. She paused. What I always knew was mine. You never told me. You never asked. She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. You never asked about much, Caleb. Not my work. Not my companies. Not what I did when you were, she paused, precise and deliberate, otherwise occupied. The board members were absolutely still. Caleb's jaw tightened. So what happens now? He asked. Simone opened the folder in front of her. Price Property Group is being restructured under Caldwell Meridian's full operational control, effective today. Your 22% stake remains intact. You'll be compensated fairly, more fairly than you deserve. She turned a page. The Buckhead property transfers to my name alone, which it was always in anyway. Our attorneys will handle the remainder of the divorce proceedings. She looked up. You'll be fine, Caleb. You're a talented man. You'll build something new. He stared at her. That's it, he said. That's it. Simone. His voice broke slightly on her name, the first genuine fracture she'd heard from him in years. I know what I did. He stopped. Started again. Did any of it mean anything to you? Was this always just? Don't, she said again. Gently this time. Almost kindly. Because she understood what he was actually asking. He was asking if he had ever been seen. If the woman across this table had ever loved him, really loved him, or if he had simply been a variable in an equation she'd already solved. And the truest, most painful answer was the one she'd given her mother in that College Park kitchen. I loved him. I was just a woman who wanted someone to come home to. But that answer was hers. It lived in her chest and in her mother's kitchen and in the red dress from the St. Regis, and it was not for this boardroom and it was not for him, not anymore. The meeting is adjourned, she said quietly. She closed her folder. She stood. And every person in that room, board members who had looked through her for 4 years, attorneys who had underestimated her, a husband who had confused her silence for weakness, watched Simone Caldwell Price button her burgundy blazer, pick up her portfolio, and walk toward the door. At the threshold she paused. Turned back once. Not to look at Caleb. To look at the room. At the Atlanta skyline filling the floor-to-ceiling windows behind the table where she had just, quietly and completely, taken back everything that had always been hers. She let herself have that one moment. Then she walked out. 3 weeks later, Simone sat on the porch of her mother's College Park house. Shoes off, feet tucked under her, a glass of sweet tea sweating in the late Atlanta afternoon. The magnolia tree was blooming. The neighborhood was Sunday quiet. Gloria was inside humming something that sounded like an old hymn. Simone's phone buzzed. A message from Kezia. Page 6 just picked up the story. Mystery black woman revealed as controlling shareholder of Price Property Group. They're calling you a shadow architect. Simone stared at her phone. Then she laughed. A real one, full and warm and rising up from somewhere deep, the kind of laugh that only comes when you've been through something that tried to break you and discovered instead that it made you permanent. Shadow architect. She set the phone face down on the porch railing. Looked out at the magnolia tree. Thought about the girl who had sat in this kitchen at 19 years old and made a promise to herself that no one, no company, no system, no man, would ever have the power to erase what she built. She had kept that promise. Not through coldness. Not through calculation. But through the particular fierce, quiet, unbreakable love that a woman has for herself when the world has spent her entire life suggesting she shouldn't. Gloria came to the screen door. Sweet tea's getting warm, baby. I know, Mama. You okay out there? Simone looked at the magnolia tree one more time. At the blooms, white and unbothered and exactly as they were supposed to be. Yeah, she said softly. She picked up her glass. I'm good.